It was the invention of the microscope that allowed for the discovery of cells during the mid to late 1600s, beginning with the microscopes designed by Robert Hooke, which is like the one pictured here, and as you saw in the video, those designed by Van Leeuwenhoek, who was the first person to observe living cells. Now, despite this, it wasn't until the mid-1800s that cells were recognized as the basic unit of life. And during this time, a German cytologist came to recognize that cells in animal and plants are the building blocks of life. So he postulated the first two principles of cell theory, namely that all organisms are composed of one or more cells, and that the cell is the basic unit of structure or the basic unit of life. Years later, a third principle was recognized, that all cells arise only by divisions from pre-existing cells. So the cell is also the basic unit of reproduction. We now know that cells take on different shapes, some of which are very interesting, and different sizes. However, most cells are small because there are important limitations to cell size, which we'll discuss later. So what are some of the basic properties of cells? We'll examine some of these today in preparation for the material that we'll cover throughout the semester. We know that organisms have to be able to acquire and to use energy, and that energy is going to be used to power cellular functions like metabolism and responses to the environment. Now, the energy that is used to drive these processes ultimately for most organisms is coming from the sun, either directly or indirectly. And that's in the form of sugars produced by photosynthetic organisms or autotrophs, which are then used by both the organisms that produce them, the autotrophs, as well as by other organisms, including animals that are not capable of directly transforming the energy of the sun into usable energy. Now, these heterotrophs use the energy stored in glucose to produce compounds like ATP that serve as the energy currency of the cell. We also know that cells carry out a large variety of chemical reactions, and that these reactions would not be possible without enzymes, most of which are proteins that serve as biological catalysts since they speed up reactions. Now, the information that makes the synthesis of these enzymes possible is present in the cell's DNA, which allows for the storage of genetic traits and the transmission of these traits from one generation to the next. The information contained in a cell's DNA is the instructions for the synthesis of proteins that serve as the molecular workers of the cell. And we know that DNA is replicated so that it can be apportioned to daughter cells during cell division, and that is then transcribed into RNA, specifically messenger RNA, which is then translated into protein. Now, this process, if you recall, is the central dogma of molecular biology, and deviations from it apply to certain viruses that have RNA genomes. So viruses can have either DNA or RNA genomes. It's very important to note that viruses, clever as they may be, are not cells. And many scientists actually don't consider them as living organisms because they are incapable of a free living existence. However, the adaptations of viruses and the responses some viruses elicit in their hosts are fascinating. An example of that is the rabies virus, which produces a range of effects, some of which could be considered Machiavellic, and those effects promote the propagation of the virus from one host to the next.
Real, I mean, what do we actually know about the disease?
I mean, not much. We know it's a very unusual virus.
Yeah. The way a typical virus travels is it has a port of entry, it replicates locally, it makes it into the bloodstream, it circulates widely, it finds its target tissues, and then it replicates there.
Right, exactly. So you get a wound, it gets infected, that goes into the blood. But rabies?
It enters the body at the bite wound site.
Say in Gina's case, the tip of her finger.
It binds to a nerve right there.
To a particular receptor.
And then crawls its way up the nervous system.
1 to 2 centimeters per day.
I think that's right, to attack the brain.
It literally grabs onto the nerve and climbs up?
It's like hand over hand.
Wow.
Might take a few days to go the length of a finger, maybe 3 weeks to go the length of an entire arm.
It's during that slow climb that we can administer vaccine and help the body mount an immune response.
If you give a person the vaccine before they see symptoms, while the virus is still climbing its way up to the brain, they should be okay.
But once the infection has taken root in the brain, then it's too late for vaccination.
The moment you have a twitchy finger, the moment you have like the slightest little flu-like symptom, which will later progress into rabies, that's the moment that you know you're going to die of that disease.
Well, what does the virus do when it gets to the brain?
Well, it's very much not known specifically what happens in the brain. It might start shutting parts of your brain down. In about 30% of the cases, the muscles might start to kind of get paralyzed. It's called paralytic rabies. Eventually, their entire body will get paralyzed and they might just slump into a coma. Or more often, it's that cliche of the rabies death is what actually happens, where people have these like spasms of rage. There are videos online where you can see people in this state.
Yeah, YouTube.
I find them impossible to watch.
People, just screaming and writhing in convulsions.
And from the virus's perspective, it's trying to drive its host to be more aggressive so that it bites somebody else and spreads more virus.
Huh.
The other thing that is, I find really perverse, is that they will get this fear of water, a really powerful fear of water.
The human victim of rabies tries to drink, wants to drink.
But then they'll bring the cup to their hands and they'll just shake and overflow.
The muscles in their throat seize up,
A gag reflex.
and they can't.
They can't drink water?
Yeah. You can imagine, though, again, from the virus's perspective, why that would be advantageous. You are trying to transmit virus through biting. So an animal who can't swallow his virus-filled saliva.
They're going to be like a loaded gun.
Right.
Although we will not elaborate greatly on the mechanisms of transcription and translation because they're covered in more detail in genetics courses, it's important to recognize that RNA is important both as an information molecule in the case of messenger RNA, which gets translated into protein, but also as an integral component of the machinery via which the mRNA itself is translated. Ribosomal RNAs are essential to the function of ribosomes, which are responsible for translating the mRNA into protein. Also needed for translation are carrier molecules that insert the appropriate amino acid into a growing polypeptide chain during protein synthesis, and this carrier function is met by transfer RNAs or tRNAs.